Hi everybody, our goal today is to wrap up the chapter on the science of evolutionary psychology and to cover the article on evaluating psychological adaptations. So from an evolutionary psychology perspective, we can get data to support hypotheses from various different sources. Archaeologists, believe it or not, are very active participants in evolutionary psychology. So archaeological records can show behavior during human evolutionary history, which is particularly important to evolutionary psychologists, right? So we can look at some of the things and artifacts that people made and used, and that can help support or refute hypotheses that we have about evolutionary psychology today. There are still hunter-gatherer societies that can be studied. Oh, I got a text. Wonderful. There are still hunter-gatherer societies that can be accessed and studied in the world today. They're being more and more exposed to industrialized cultures, but they still practice traditional hunter-gatherer ways of life. Observation. All psychologists can use observation as a means of generating hypotheses and figuring out how best to approach these particular questions that we have about evolutionary psychology. Self-report is very commonly used in testing evolutionary hypotheses, and this can be in the form of interviews or oral histories or simple survey data. But finally, looking at human products, the things that we have today and how they may be indicative of the way life was previously. So common examples here are cheeseburgers and pornography, right? So why do we like cheeseburgers so much when they're so bad for you? Well, because during our course of our evolutionary history, calories were kind of difficult to come by, and so we talked about this earlier. The organisms that were that found high-calorie foods, fat and salt's not really high calorie, but it's required for your diet. The organisms that liked those things and ate them when they found them, they were rare, right? They fared better than those that say, I don't like high-calorie foods, right? And so we still have these evolved behavioral adaptations today. However, it's a lot easier to come by high-calorie foods, and this is why we have the opposite problem of not having enough calories, but we have an obesity problem. And pornography is attractive and used in advertising, right? Those organisms that found pornography in the real sense of the word, not in the virtual sense of the word, something that was appealing to them, would reproduce. Those that were not down with it didn't pass on those genetic traits. And other things, you know, the media, cultural events. Why do people have such ardent adoration for their sports teams, right? It goes to kind of social groups, right? And an in-group, out-group sort of thing. Some of the things that we talk about really intersect well with social psychology. All right, let's talk a little bit about this article. Evaluating evidence of psychological adaptation. How do we know one when we see one? So when we're looking at an adaptation, we have to be careful to distinguish between the adaptation with respect to the verb of process of adapting to something and the end product of the process of evolution, or the, not really the end product, but the current stage adaptation, right? Because we're continuing to evolve. We're going to talk about the noun. And so we're going to ask the question, how are adaptations identified? And Williams did a good job of this in the 60s, but it was a little incomplete, right? So he specified that it has a special design for the purpose of increasing fitness, and it leads to differential genetic contributions across generations. The first part's a little problematic, right? A special design for the purpose of increasing fitness. Well, what's a special design? Isn't that kind of subjective? Well, that's just something that leads to the purpose of increasing fitness. So it's kind of a circular argument, right? And that is problematic in a logical sense. Things that that don't serve the purpose of increasing fitness don't have a special design. So we're going to look at how organisms evolved these psychological adaptations. Where are we going to look? Well, we'll start from a theoretical perspective, right? We're going to look at inclusive fitness, reciprocal altruism, and problems of survival. These are big kind of driving forces theoretically in evolutionary psychology. Doesn't mean that we can't find an observation and things that we see every day and look for adaptations in explaining that behavior. Adaptations will be functional. They have to have a logical way in which they would aid survival and or reproduction. And they're going to be domain specific. They're going to solve a particular problem that our ancestors faced in their environment, either survival or reproductive. They will be mostly universal, right? And this is because if it's an evolved characteristic of a species, then we would expect for most of the members of that species to have this evolved characteristic. So if you can find something that is a cross-cultural universal, then it's a good indication that, or at least some support for the idea that it may be an adaptive behavior. It's going to be interactive with the environment. Behavioral adaptations arose in response to environmental problems. It'll generally be complex, usually created from previous adaptations. Optimal design is rare, right? So the argument that, well, you know, it's probably not an adaptation because it would be better if. Adaptations aren't optimally designed. They are functional and they get the job done better than not having that particular adaptation. And they're efficient. They can't waste energy or resources beyond the point at which they provide a benefit. All right. Now we get to the nitty-gritty kind of stuff of this article. The article draws an analogy between the ways in which we evaluate adaptationist hypotheses about behavior and cognition and construct validity. Psychologists rely a lot on construct validity, even though we don't always acknowledge it. So it's refers to whether something that you're measuring, a scale, actually correlates with the theorized psychological construct. All right, so what does that mean? Well, what kinds of things do psychologists study? Well, they study romantic attraction. They study depression. They study violence. They study intelligence, right? What are all these things? We know what they are. We know what intelligence is, right? You know, kind of a good, kind of everyday understanding of intelligence, but how do you measure intelligence? Well, we have a test that measures intelligence. Well, all right, is it any good? Does it have construct validity? It takes looking at the correlation of the measure being evaluated with the variables that are known to be related to this construct. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that we're going to kind of take some things that we think are related to depression, for example, and we're going to see is there a correlation between this measure of depression that we have and other measures of depression, right? So the kind of big names in construct validity were Cronbach and Meehl, and they wanted to look at how construct validity is constructed of like what's called a nomological network. So a lawful network of relationships between things that are all kind of pointing toward the construct that we're interested in, whether it's depression or intelligence or happiness or sociability, whatever it is, all these things that psychologists study. A lot of times it's hard to like put your finger on it. Like, we know what it means, but how do you measure it? And are the measures that we're using a good representation of the thing that we're trying to get at, right? So we have theoretical propositions that specify linkages between constructs. As age increases, memory loss increases, right? And so how are we going to measure age? Well, we're going to ask how old are you, or we're going to look at your birth certificate or whatever. How are we going to measure memory? Well, we're going to give you a test for memory, right? The empirical constructs are variables that can actually be measured. Those are the things that we're after, right? So we know what memory is. It's your ability to remember things. Well, how are we going to measure that? Well, we're going to give you a memory test. We know what age is. We're going to measure that. And if our idea about memory and age is right, then we should have a lawful relationship or a correlation between those things. Here's an example of how one might measure the construct validity for depression. So we know what depression is, right? But there's all these things that go with it, right? So indecision, failure, feeling of guilt, sadness, pessimism, suicidal thoughts, loss of interest, loss of energy, tiredness, fatigue, agitation, changes in appetite. All of these things are parts of depression that we can kind of measure, right? Even if it's a self-report measure. On a scale of 1 to 10, how sad do you feel? Well, if sadness is something that is related to depression, then we should have a high relationship, a high correlation between their depression and their measures of sadness, right? So here's what evolutionary psychologists have done to identify adaptation. They've adopted the kind of nomological networks and the lawful relationships among constructs with respect to measuring an adaptation. So we can use this network of evidence in the same way that people who use construct validity to study constructs that we can't actually measure directly. So love, right? Love is a construct. How do you measure it? Well, you have all these little things that kind of point to the construct that you are interested in studying. We can't study behavioral adaptations directly, right? We don't have access to the exact conditions that were in place 10,000 years ago when some of these things may have been instantiated. So we need to make a circumstantial case with as many different types of evidence as we can to be more confident that the behavior or the cognitive process that we're examining is a product of evolution. And so we start with the theoretical case. Does it make sense? Is there a rationale by which this proposed adaptation could have led to increased survival or reproductive benefits? Is it cross-cultural? This is an important characteristic, right? So if we find that whatever we're examining here or evaluating as a hypothesized adaptation is present in all cultures that we know of, then it lends a little bit more credence to the idea that maybe it's an adaptive process. Is it present in hunter-gatherer societies? We know that we can use evidence from hunter-gatherer societies to provide evidence that behaviors that we have are adaptive. Is it present in other species? Is there phylogenetic evidence of it, right? So if we're saying that this is an evolved adaptation, then it would make sense that it's present in species that are similar to us genetically, right? Is it in other primates? Is it in other mammals? Is it, we can find psychological evidence, right? So here's where we can bring people into the laboratory and do kind of self-report, or we can do experiments we can do experiments online, right? We'll talk a little bit about how to do that later. But the idea is that do people have decision-making processes or other types of behavior that are in line with our hypothesis? Can we find evidence to support our hypothesized adaptation by doing straight-up psychology experiments? We can look at medical evidence, right? We can look at injury reports for adopted versus biological children. We can look at physiological data. We have the ability now to do brain imaging to look at or examine a potential physiological mechanism that we believe supports our adaptive behavior. And we can also now look at genetic evidence. So psychologists are beginning now to make better use of the techniques for looking at genetic information with respect to behavior. So the article then talks about 4 really well-supported examples that we believe are adaptive behaviors. And these are pregnancy, sickness, incest avoidance, men's short-term desire for more partners than women have, and easily learned fear of snakes. And I'll let you kind of go through the article and take a look at that. And I don't want to put any comments in your head based on our perusal or your comment papers. But these are well-supported kinds of hypothesized adaptation, and perhaps pregnancy sickness is the best of those. I'm happy to take questions. Drop me an email, put it in the perusal, or put it in your comment paper.